From Troy Public Radio, this is TPR Podcast Presents. I'm Austin Toy. Every Monday, we bring you selections from one of Troy Public Radio's 13 podcasts. Today's selection comes from our most recent episode of Alabama Aloud, a short story podcast where Don Noble reads the work of Alabama authors. This is an excerpt from Lee Smith's story, Tongues of Fire, about a bright and impressionable teenage girl during a very stressful time in her childhood.
That fall of Daddy's nervous breakdown, the Methodist Church was visited by an unusually charismatic young preacher named Johnny Rock Malone, while Mr. Treble Roach, our own preacher, was down at Duke, having a hernia operation. I was late to church that day and arrived all by myself after the service had already started. The congregation was on its feet singing, "I Come to the Garden Alone," one of my favorite hymns. One unfamiliar voice led all the rest. I slipped in next to Granddaddy, found the right page in the hymnal, and craned my neck around Miss Eulalie Butters' big black hat to see who was up there singing so nice. It looked like an angel to me, probably the angel Gabriel, because of his curly blonde hair. And he was so young, just out of seminary, somebody said after the service. It was a warm fall Sunday, and rays of colored light shot through the stained glass windows at the side of the church to glance off Johnny Rock Malone's pale face. He walks with me, and he talks with me, we sang. My heart started beating double time. Johnny Rock Malone stretched out his long, thin arms and spread his long, white fingers. "Beloved," he said, curling his fingers, "let us pray." But I never closed my eyes that day, staring instead at the play of light on Johnny Rock Malone's fair face. It was almost like a kaleidoscope. Then the round, rosy window behind him, behind the altar, began to pulse with light, to glow with light, now brighter, now not, like a neon sign. I got the message. I was no dummy. In a way, I had been waiting all my life for this to happen. The most notable thing about me as a child, before I got religious, was my obsessive reading. I had always been an inveterate reader of the sort who hides underneath the covers with a flashlight and reads all night long. But I did not read casually, or for mere entertainment, or for information. What I wanted was to feel all wild and trembly inside, an effect first produced by The Secret Garden, which I'd read maybe 20 times. And the Reverend Johnny Rock Malone looked exactly the way I had always pictured Colin. In fact, listening to him preach, I felt exactly the way I felt when I read The Secret Garden. Just exactly. Other books which had affected me strongly were Little Women, especially the part where Beth dies, and Gone with the Wind, especially the part where Melanie dies. I had long hoped for a wasting disease, such as leukemia, to test my mettle. I also loved Marjorie Morningstar, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, Heidi, and books like Dear and Glorious Physician, The Shoes of the Fisherman, Christie, and anything at all about horses and saints. I had read all the Black Stallion books, of course, as well as all the Marguerite Henry books. But my all-time favorite was God's Girl, especially the frontispiece illustration picturing Joan as she knelt and, quote, prayed without ceasing for guidance from God, end quote, whose face was depicted overhead in a thunderstorm. Not only did I love Joan of Arc, I wanted to be her. The only man I had ever loved more than Colin of The Secret Garden to date was Johnny Tremain from Esther Forbes's book of that title. I used to wish that it was me, not Johnny Tremain, who'd had the hot silver spilled on my hand. I would have suffered anything, everything, for Johnny Tremain. But on that fateful Sunday morning, Johnny Rock Malone eclipsed both Colin and Johnny Tremain in my affections. It was a wipeout. I felt as fluttery and wild as could be. In fact, I felt too crazy to pay attention to the sermon which Johnny Rock Malone was, by then, almost finished with. I tried to concentrate, but my mind was whirling. The colors from the windows seemed to deepen and swirl. Then suddenly, I heard him loud and clear, reading from Revelations. And I saw a great white throne, and him that sat on it, from whose face the earth and heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God, and the books were opened, and whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. I can't remember much about what happened after that. I got to shake hands with him as we left the church, and I was surprised to find that his hand was cool, not burning hot, and, though bony, somehow as soft as a girl's. I looked hard at Johnny Rock Malone as he stood in front of our pretty little church, shaking hands. He was on his way to someplace else, over in Mississippi. We would never see him again. I would never see him again. And yet somehow I felt exhilarated and satisfied in a way. I can't explain it. Back at my grandparents' house, I couldn't even eat any lemon meringue pie. I felt shaky and hot, like I might be getting a virus. I went home early. My father was upstairs in his study, door closed. Nobody else was home. I wandered the house. Then I sat in the Florida room for a while, staring out at the day. After a while, I picked up my mother's sewing basket from the coffee table, got a needle and threaded it with blue thread, and sewed all the fingers of my left hand together through the cuticle. Then I held out my hand and admired it, wishing desperately for my best friend Alice Field of Little Rock. I had no best friend now, nobody to show my amazing hand to. Weird little Edwin Lee lived right across the street, but it was inconceivable that I would show him, the nerd, such a hand as this. So I showed it to nobody. I left it sewed up until Mama's white Cadillac pulled in the driveway, and then I cut the thread between my fingers and pulled it out. It was about this time, too, that I began to pray a lot. Without ceasing was my intention, and set little fires all around the neighborhood. These fires were nothing much. I'd usually take some shredded newspapers or some Kleenex, find a few sticks, and they'd burn themselves out in a matter of minutes. I made a fire in my treehouse, in our garage, in the sink, in the basement, on Mrs. Butters's back patio, on Mr. and Mrs. Harold Castle's front porch, and in little Charlotte Lee's playhouse. Here I went too far, singeing off the hair of her Barbie doll. She never could figure out how it happened. I entertained visions of being a girl evangelist, of appearing with Billy Graham on television, of traveling throughout Mississippi with Johnny Rock Malone. I'd be followed everywhere I went by a little band of my faithful. I made a small fire in the bed of Ashley's new boyfriend's pickup truck while he and my sister were in the den petting and watching the hit parade. They didn't have any idea I was outside in the night, watching them through the window, making a fire in the truck. They all thought I was in bed. Although I was praying a lot, my prayers were usually specific, as opposed to without ceasing. For instance, I'd tell one friend I'd go shopping with her, and then something I really wanted to do would come up, and I'd call back and say I couldn't come after all, that my grandmother had died. And then I would go to my room and fling myself to the floor and pray without ceasing that my lie would not be found out and that my grandmother would not really die. I made big deals with God. If he would make sure I got away with it this time, I would talk to Edwin Lee for 5 minutes on the bus, 3 days in a row. Or I would clean out my closet. He did his part, I did mine. I grew in power every day.
You can hear the full version of Tongues of Fire and all the short stories from Alabama Aloud on NPR One, YouTube, or at today.troy.edu/podcasts. I'm Austin Toy, and this is TPR Podcast Presents on listener-supported Troy Public Radio.